All right, folks, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we'll go ahead and hold off on the chat, and we'll use it for you guys to answer any questions that I have. And I'm going to have a lot of questions for you guys today. Today, our plan is to take a look at genre. It's the last thing I'm going to teach you guys this year, genre. So we're going to do a bit of a genre study, and we're going to look at the different qualities of various genres, and we're going to look to work to identify the genre of different pieces that we might know or don't know based off of their descriptions to sort of demonstrate our understanding or our growing understanding of what the qualities of various genres are. And then what you guys are going to do for me for Friday is you're going to continue to write. You're going to keep working on your rising action. And you're going to go ahead and as sort of like a final piece, you're going to tell me in your document somewhere what genre after our study you think that your story belongs to. Okay? So that's what we'll be doing today. We're going to cover about half the genres, most of the fiction genres today. And then we'll even start some identification practice as well, which should be fun. Okay. I think that is it. So I'll post the updated assignment, which is just barely updated, on my website, and on Classroom I'll update the rising action and climax assignment right after we're done our stream today. Okay, so that is that. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll dive in here. I got a nice Prezi for you guys today. We'll do about half of it, like I said, and we're going to look at genre. First of all, we're going to figure out what it is, and then we're going to figure out what the different types and kinds of genres are, right? So let's rewind and take a look at the concept itself, okay? And I think that one of the best ways to get your head around what genre is to think about it in terms of music, right? A lot of the time, the types of music that people like is like a little bit polarized, meaning that oftentimes people will like one genre of music but not another genre. And think about some of the different genres that exist for music, right? There's alternative, country, dance, electronic, hip hop, pop, country, world, different kind of soundtracks. There's R&B, etc. Right? So there are a lot of different categories. So in order to get our head around this sort of like categorical type of thinking, right? These genres, in the chat, tell me one genre of music you like and one genre of music you don't like or are not as big of a fan of, right? So one genre you like and one genre you don't like. And I'll post those instructions right here for you guys. So in the chat, identify one genre of music you like and one genre of music you aren't as big a fan of. Oh, that's okay, Maddie. Don't worry about it. So, like for mine, like one genre of music I like is what do I like? I like indie music, like indie rock, and one genre of music I'm not a fan of is country. Don't like country music. Also, show tunes. I don't like that at all. So let's see, you guys, your categorical thinking here. Maddie likes pop, is not a fan of country. Melanie likes country, not a fan of rock and roll. Jake likes rock and dislikes rap. Nathan likes country, doesn't like modern pop. Sure. These are all excellent ones. Sarah's likes classical, but not too big of a fan of pop. Bella likes rock, doesn't like some rap. Carolyn likes pop, doesn't like classical. That's excellent. Yeah, you guys, you've got it. You figured it out. So, pretty much any type of media. Ava says one genre she likes is metal and does not like is country. Pretty much any medium, right? So remember, medium or media is, music, TV shows, video games, etc. Can be categorized according to genres. So we are going to do that thinking, but we're going to think about it in terms of literature, right? So there are many different types of genres or types of books, and all categories of books can be called either fiction or nonfiction, okay? So this is point of confusion number one, and it's like the biggest point of confusion when it comes to genre. You know, every year when I teach genre, or when I get like a new batch of sixth graders and I say, you know, they're looking for a book recommendation, I'll say, what kind of books do you like? And they say, fiction. Fiction is not a genre, right? Fiction is a category of genres, all right? So when you're thinking about literature, every genre is either under the umbrella of fiction or nonfiction. Okay. So if you think about those top level pieces, fiction and nonfiction, they are not genres. They're not genres of literature. They are categories of genres, right? There are the categories that we put genres underneath, okay? So when I ask you what kind of literature do you like to read, you're not going to say fiction or nonfiction. Instead, you're going to be identifying a genre that fits under those different umbrellas, right? And that's kind of how we'll break the different genres down of whether they fall into the category of fiction or nonfiction, okay? So I want to make sure you understand this, right? So before we move on, let me know if you have any questions in the chat, so you can ask your question, or you can say, I understand, okay? So either way, say, I understand that, you know, fiction and nonfiction are not genres. They are categories of genres, or you can say whatever your question is, okay? Brennan likes jazz, doesn't like rap. Metallica is a band that falls under that metal genre. Derek, DJ likes metal, not a fan of country. Hi, McKenna. McKenna, what is one genre of music you like and one genre of music you're not as big a fan of? Hi, Dylan. Dylan, what is one genre of music you like and one that you're not a fan of? Maddie understands. That's good. Let me know in the chat. Either ask a question or let me know you understand. What we were just talking about for McKenna and Dylan, who just joined, we are clarifying the idea that when we talk about genres, right, which are like types of books or types of music or whatever, when we talk about genres of literature, we don't say fiction or nonfiction. Fiction and nonfiction are not genres. They're categories of genres. So when we think about genres of literature, they're always going to go under the category fiction or nonfiction. So that was the first thing. That's really the only thing we've done so far, is clarify that point. Just caught you up here, Dylan. That was all, Dylan. Jake completely understands. Okay, good. Looks like we're in good shape. Let's keep going. Let's start to dig into some of the genres themselves. So, what are the differences between fiction and nonfiction? Well, you guys know this, but let's just recap. Fiction, as you guys know, is stories that are made up, right? They are a made-up story that can tell about how things could happen, right? Usually we read them for pleasure or fun, right? Characters could be real, they could be imaginary, they could be animals, and they could tell about things that could happen, like I had said. They could be very realistic, they could be very fantastic, but the bottom line is the things that happen in a fiction story did not actually happen. They have not happened in the real world. That is not how things have ever gone down. Those people, they're not real. That is fiction, okay? The easy way to think about it is like fiction equals fake. That's kind of like the way I remember it. Nonfiction equals not fake, okay? In this case, this is where we get like our informative text, right? We haven't talked about Moonbird for a few months, so let's talk about Moonbird. Moonbird is nonfiction because of the following reasons. The author's an expert on the subject, and that subject is real. It exists in the real world. The author is a person writing about that thing. It contains facts that can be checked or proven, right? They're actual events that have happened, experiments, data, etc. And the information that's communicated in nonfiction is true. Whether it's like a science, like informative text like Moonbird, or if it's a more piece of narrative nonfiction that still tells a story, or if it's like an autobiography or a biography that tells a story of someone's life exactly as it occurred. Nonfiction is non-fake. They're actually things that have happened in the real world, okay? So fiction, fake, nonfiction, not fake, okay? And usually we read fiction for entertainment, for pleasure, and usually we read nonfiction for information, to learn something, though those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can learn things from reading fiction, and you can be entertained by reading nonfiction. I really like reading nonfiction. As you guys know, if you recall some of the books that I read, like when I told you all about Edwin Rist and stealing those feathers from the museum. That was in a nonfiction book that I read called The Feather Thief, etc. Right? So let me know in the chat now, do you have any questions about fiction or nonfiction, or do you understand? Same idea. I want everyone to respond. Do you understand, or do you have a question? Please feel free to ask a question about the difference between fiction and nonfiction. Oh yeah, Moonbird, Fatbird. Nathaniel likes pop, punk rock, not a fan of country. That's fine, you don't have to choose one. You're thinking categorically, and that's definitely the point here. So nicely done. No questions. McKenna understands. Excellent. Wait a few minutes here. So just let me know. Do you any questions, or just let me know that you understand so I feel confident to move on. No cues. Jake, what's your pet slug's name? Okay, good. Looks like we're ready to move on here. Oops. Okay. So let's look at some different genres of fiction then. So we'll look at some different genres of fiction and some different genres of nonfiction, okay? So the first genre of fiction that I want to talk about is one that I think a lot of people really like, which is mystery and... Oh, and there's something I want to say about genre. Look, this is again, not science, right? So we typically try to fit books into the genre that makes the most sense, but it's very rare that a book only fits one genre, right? Oftentimes books, they fall into parts of multiple genres, and ultimately what we try to do is we try to make a call, right? So Miss Brennan has to do this all the time in the library, right? When she gets a new batch of books in and she reads the book, or she reads the excerpt of a book, the abstract, what she has to do is she has to decide what genre best fits this book, right? Very rarely is it a perfect fit, right? And oftentimes the questions that arise are due to the fact that the book could fit multiple genres. But ultimately what we try to do as, students of literature and, critics is make the best choice possible, okay? So you're going to see some different examples down here. Some of them will make a lot of sense, like the Goosebump book. And maybe some you'll say really, Lightning Thief? Is that best described as mystery and thriller? Maybe. So as you guys know, mystery and thrillers are suspenseful stories meant to scare or keep the reader guessing, right? You don't have all of the information. And so you read to find out more, and slowly things get revealed. It usually has clues or a secret that's not solved until the end of the story, right? So, very categorically, Goosebumps, or any of the R.L. Stine books, pretty much everything Stephen King writes falls into this category of mystery and thriller. Agatha Christie, the Sherlock Holmes stories. These are all mystery and thriller books. But if you think about Lightning Thief, well, that's a mystery. Who stole Zeus's lightning bolt is the motivating conflict of that story. And so in that way, it fits this mystery and thriller category, right? But this is one you guys know, and one that many of you guys like. The next is fantasy, and this is probably the most beloved in 6th grade. I think this is the most actively read genre. Miss Brennan probably could actually give us exact data on what the most read genre is at Luther Burbank Middle School. But if I was a betting man, I would say it's fantasy. And you guys know that fantasy are stories that include elements that are impossible, right? That couldn't exist in the real world, like magic, mythical creatures, or talking animals. And if we were really splitting hairs, which we're not going to do, you can actually split the genre fantasy into two subgenres, high fantasy and low fantasy. But we're not going to do that. We're Twilight is considered low fantasy, or something like Lord of the Rings is considered high fantasy. Due to the scope and scale of the worlds that are created, generally speaking, I said I wasn't going to go into it. High fantasy are invented worlds, whereas low fantasy tends to take place in worlds that exist, right? Twilight very much takes place in Washington State. That's a real place place. Whereas, Lord of the Rings takes place in Middle Earth. That's an invented world with its own set of rules. And so that's high fantasy, right? But yeah, Harry Potter definitely falls in. I think it's probably high fantasy counts. Twilight, Lovely Bones. You could say, well, Percy Jackson as well. Yeah, that would fit fantasy as well. Lots and lots of the very popular series books fall into the fantasy genre. Oops. And historical fiction. So historical fiction is a fictional story that takes place in a particular time period of the past. So it's like the setting is real, but the characters and events in that setting are not, right? So the setting's real, but the characters are made up from the author's imagination. And in historical fiction, the setting, meaning the time and the place, is fundamentally important because the story couldn't make sense if you took it out and placed it in another time, right? So if you wanted to write a story about your experiences with remote learning during the coronavirus quarantine of 2020, if you wanted to set that story in, 2006, well, you can't because that didn't happen in 2006, right? So that's what, in that way, historical fiction is highly dependent upon the place that and time that the story occurs within. Okay, so let's take a break, and I want some engagement from you guys. Okay, so let's look at historical fiction, fantasy, and mystery and thriller. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me one book that that falls into either the mystery and thriller, fantasy, or historical fiction genre, and tell me which genre it belongs to. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like. So identify one book that fits into the mystery, fantasy, or historical fiction genre, and tell me which genre it belongs to. So for example, one of the books that I read this year was The Once and Future King, which is high fantasy, classic high fantasy. I'll just put fantasy. I'm not confuse you guys otherwise. So we've already got some coming in. Nathan's is Spy School, which is mystery. Very good. Jake says Keeper of the Lost Cities, fantasy. Absolutely. I Survived, which is historical fiction. Very good, Nathaniel. Dylan, your job is to work on that for 20 minutes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Days we don't have streams. But it does not have to be finished. DJ is correct. Wolves of the Beyond is fantasy? Yeah, because I assume that it's about the wolves. Warriors, the Between, Keeper of the Lost Cities are all fantasy. They are. Yep. They are, yes. So, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't read an I Survive book. They are based on real events, but the characters in those events are not real. So that's why it's the historical fiction. If the people were real too, it would be biography. Capture the Flag's a mystery. Ranger's Apprentice is high fantasy. Oh, very good, Sarah. Wonder is nonfiction. Nope. So, McKenna, you're right now, I don't think you have the genre that Wonder belongs in. So if it was nonfiction, which remember is not a genre, it's a category of genres, it would have to be something that actually happened in the real world. But hang on to Wonder because we haven't gone over that particular genre yet. It is definitely, Carolyn. Yep. Okay, good. Yeah, you guys have got it. So let's continue to go here. We're going to go now to science fiction, which is another beloved one for sure. These are stories that use elements of science and technology that are not a part of the real world. So they feel a lot like fantasy, but they usually takes place in like a future. Oftentimes our dystopian pieces are science fiction because they take place in the future. And much of the sort of like amazing or out of this world things that happen are not magical, but they're based off of like advanced science, right? So, they often take place in this future or alternative world, right? So Hunger Games is, I think, is definitely a piece of science fiction because it takes place in sort of like a dystopian future United States, and they have a lot of advanced technology with like the mixing and matching of the different like humans and animals and the like the birds themselves and etc. Wrinkle in Time is a piece of science fiction because there's like time travel in it as well. War of the Worlds is like stories about aliens. Lots and lots of good science fiction ones. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Star Wars is a piece of science fiction, Star Trek. You guys know a lot of these different pieces. Let's do a few more before I ask you guys to identify. Realistic fiction. So, realistic fiction is a story with characters, settings, and problems that are made up, but they could absolutely be true. Like they could exist in the real world. They don't. They're made up. They're an invention of the author, but they could happen in the real world, right? There's no magic. There's no like advanced science. There's no time travel. There's no genies. There's none of that. It's very grounded in realism, and often this genre of literature is highly focused on the characters and what's going on with those characters, their relationships, their experiences in like everyday activities like school, etc. That's realistic fiction. Another very, very popular one, and perhaps the major contender of fantasy with like most read books in our library. And then we've got poetry. You guys know what poetry is. Poetry is really easy to identify as a genre because it's not written in prose, which is like paragraphs like you're writing now, but it's written in verse, which means it has rhythm and meter and it's constructed in stanzas usually. And this, poetry, what is it for? Its job is to create a response of thought and feeling from the reader. It doesn't always actually tell a story, right? Or it tells a very brief story. It uses rhyme, rhythm, and other literary devices. We looked at a few from Shel Silverstein. If anyone has ever scarred you for life by reading You Love That Dog, then that's something. Funny story about Love That Dog. My first year teaching, I just thought it was like a book about loving dogs. So I read it to my sixth graders the day before Christmas break. And if you've read Love That Dog, it's like devastating. And they're like, why would you do this to us? It was not my best moment. So let's look. So we've got poetry. Oh, let's not look at traditional yet. We got poetry, realistic fiction, and science fiction. So same ask here. Identify a book that you know that falls into one of those categories and tell me which category it belongs to. Based on a true story is not nonfiction. Because based on a true story usually means that 1% of it happened in the real world and 99% of it is made up. Oh, that's really nice, Nathan. Oh, no kidding. So let me copy my instructions here. So we did sci-fi, realistic fiction, poetry. And have I read any sci-fi realistic fiction? Yeah, I'm reading The Brothers Karamazov, which is realistic fiction. Yes. Yes, it is, Sarah. Unschooled is realistic fiction. Yep. Call of Cthulhu is fantasy. Yeah, that's it. You could still call it poetry. That would be fine, Nathaniel, if you're thinking of like Love That Dog or something. Love That Dog is a book written in verse. Poetry. Hunt for Red October is science fiction. Yeah, I think so. I don't know it, so I'll take your word for it. Here, let me take these off for a second because they just died and I don't know if I'll need them. Blended as realistic fiction, sure. All right, very good. So let's go look at a few others. So Wonder, like McKenna, to answer your question or go back, Wonder's going to fall into the realistic fiction category. It deals with, kids who are realistic going through like, very relatable troubles, trials, and tribulations at school. All those things could happen in the real world, but it's an invention of the author, right? She made up those characters, the things that happen. So your Wonder would fall into realistic fiction. It almost feels like nonfiction because the characters feel like they could be so real, but if they're an invention of the author or the authors surrounding them with events that are of their own construction, you got realistic fiction. The next one is traditional. And these are like stories that have passed down from one group to another in history. It's like folk tales, legends, fables, fairy tales, tall tales, and myths. So your traditional stories about like the Greek gods are traditional. It falls into the genre of like traditional literature. Any of the Aesop's fables, John Henry, The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Three Little Pigs, etc. Those are all traditional stories, right? They come from various places, right? Aesop, Grimm's fairy tales, lots of different sources from lots of different countries. But essentially what happens is these stories, like, they're pretty brief. They usually contain some sort of like moral lesson, and they become a part of like the collective consciousness of the people who live in the communities that those stories become a part of. What that means is like everyone sort of knows the stories and can reference them on the fly, right? Like if you went up to somebody and you said like, if I was like trying to teach my kid not to lie and I was like, listen, you don't want to be like the boy who cried wolf, odds are, through exposure and just kind of like hearing that quick story, he would know what I meant, right? Or if you referenced Cinderella to someone, chances are they'll know what you're talking about, right? Versus if you go up to somebody and you're like, oh my gosh, that's like just like the time that Dooku escaped the clone troopers. They'll be like, wait, what? Which time or who's Dooku? Because that story's a little bit less ingrained in the collective consciousness, right? So that's traditional literature, right? These are the ones that like everybody just sort of knows, right? Because they've been around a long time. They're pretty brief, and they usually inform some sort of like, moral lesson. And then, my expertise over here in drama, although, interestingly enough, I'm very, very narrow in my expertise here. So drama are plays, right? Stories involving a conflict of characters that's meant to be acted out in a play. You guys know that I've spent most of my time as a literary critic with this beautiful looking specimen right here, Mr. William Shakespeare. I know a lot about his plays. I spend a lot of time in his plays, etc. So I, really like reading drama rather, but that's a genre I don't really branch out too much in, right? There are definitely playwrights I like to read, Tennessee Williams and etc. I'm trying to remember who wrote like The Crimple of Inishmaan. That's a really good one too. But like you guys know, or like Dickens wrote Christmas Carol, but I'm not going to go see Wicked. I'm not interested in seeing Cats at all, right? If there's a song, I'm not going to look at it. So I like some drama, right? Shakespeare, but other not so much for me, right? But drama, it's a play, right? It's literature. You can read it as literature, but realistically, it's meant to be acted out, okay? So these are different categories, genres that fall under the category of fiction. It's not all of them. There are a lot, but they're the ones that I think that you'll see hanging out most often. Okay? So before we go on to nonfiction, I want to ask you guys if you have any questions about fiction, that category of genre, or any of the genres that we went over that fall into the category of fiction. Any questions at all? Again, you can just tell me what your question is, or you can write no questions. Divergent, science fiction, true sight. Yep. Realistic fiction, ungifted. Because you're almost 7th graders. On the Run. Yep. Yeah. Oh, I know. It has Sean Connery in it. Yeah, I know what you're talking about, Nathan. Random House Book of Shakespeare. Well, it depends, right? If it has all of Shakespeare's sonnets, then it would just be poetry. But if it's got those and it's got his plays too, and Shakespeare's definitely known for his sonnets, but he's much more prevalently known for his plays, that would be drama. But Shakespeare did write a bunch of sonnets, and he also wrote like Troilus and Cresside, which is a very long poem, and there was another one too. Land of Stories. Ooh, Sarah asks a good question. Would Land of Stories kind of be traditional? I think it's probably fantasy if I was to do it, but the story itself, that world is constructed through traditional stories. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. It's a little bit in between. Legend of the Phantom Wolf. I don't know it. It could be. It depends on where it's come from and how old it is, right? If it's something new, it's probably not traditional. Traditional literature is probably it has to be 100 years old or something. Phantom of the Opera is drama. Twilight, that's going to be your fantasy. Is The Tempest drama? Yes. Absolutely. That's one of Shakespeare's. Oh, yeah, it's awesome. Haley, let me give you the best piece of advice I could ever give you. Do not watch that Cats Live movie. I don't think there's any coming back from that nightmare-wise. I don't think you'll ever sleep again. It's also generally panned as the worst movie ever made, right? So I don't even know if Taylor Swift can save it. Phantom of the Opera is drama. It is. Yeah, horror. Sorry, horror is a genre. It's just not one that I put up here. Yep. It's different than thriller and mystery, right? It's definitely its own thing, but not one that I was interested in including on this particular slideshow. The Grinch? Yeah, that's probably traditional at this point. Okay, cool. So I think that the nonfiction, even though we read it less, is easier to navigate, right? In addition to the the category of genre nonfiction, you could break that category into subcategories where it's narrative nonfiction and informative nonfiction. Don't worry about it. You guys have seen the difference. The articles that you read in Newsela were, informative nonfiction, expository nonfiction, another way to say it. Whereas Moonbird was narrative nonfiction. It gives you information, but it also tells you a story. So, and the informational, biography, and autobiography. Informational could be either biography and autobiography. Almost always are narrative nonfiction, right? This one could be expository or narrative. These are almost always narrative. So let's look at them. Biography, as you guys know, is a story of a person's life just as it occurred, right? Facts about a person's life, but it's not written by that person. It's written by somebody else, right? So if you look at the Rosa Parks story, it's through interviews with Rosa Parks, but it's ghost written by somebody else. This book about Abraham Lincoln and his life was written by George McGovern, who was, not Abraham Lincoln. And this book about Michael Jordan is from Matt Christopher and not Michael Jordan himself, right? So the definition of biography is it's a story about a real person's life that actually happened, but it's not written by that person. It's written by somebody else. And usually they get the information about that person's life by researching and oftentimes interviewing that person, right, to a great extent. Abraham Lincoln, obviously not an interview. This is going to be research. Michael Jordan, maybe research, maybe an interview, right? The next is autobiography. It's almost the same as biography, right? These both tell the story of a real person's life, and it's a true story. But in the case of autobiography, this is the story of a person's life that's actually written by that person, right? Ish, okay? So I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. It's kind of irrelevant, but sort of funny, right? So, look, this is a book about David Beckham, by David Beckham, where he tells his story, right? This is a book by Drew Brees about his life. This is a book by Miley Cyrus about her life, right? So, to what degree do these people write their own autobiographies? Maybe So anywhere between 100% and like 10%, so what oftentimes these people will do, right? And I'm not like, not to like hate on Miley Cyrus, but did Miley Cyrus like sit down and write a book about her life? I don't think so. Right, writing a book is actually hard, right? And specifically, it takes a lot of time, and it's a labor of love. And I mean, think about all the things that you guys have had to learn just to construct a coherent narrative, right? There are things you've got to know, and it takes work to get good at it, right? So, is Miley Cyrus good at writing? I have no clue. If I was to make a guess, I would say she's probably, been busy doing other things, right? Does she have time to sit down and, spend the hours and hours? I'm talking hundreds of hours to write a book about her life. No way, right? She's too busy breaking walls down with wrecking balls, right? Or whatever. So what oftentimes people will do when they're very famous or whatever, and they want to like make some money and they're popular, so they want to, essentially sell their story to people, is they hire a ghostwriter. And a ghostwriter is, somebody who's very good at writing and has probably written books in the past, but maybe hasn't, been very popular in their writing, or etc. And what that person does is they sit down and they get information from Miley Cyrus. She like tells them about her life, and they write it down, and then their name doesn't go on it, right? So what's the difference between that and like an interview, and like the other pieces? The difference is that the person who the book is about specifically hired that person to kind of write the book for them. But it's sort of like their words through discussion that inform that narrative, right? So autobiography, it's really good, but don't always assume that the person whose name is on it actually like sat down with like pen and paper or their computer and actually like constructed the narrative. Usually somebody else did that. And that's autobiography. Just a little bit of information about the genre. And then finally, you've got informational texts, right? This is a super, super broad genre. There's so much that falls into this. Informational texts are texts that provide factual information about a topic, right? Like Roof of Red Knots, or, anything, Fortnite, in some of the articles that you guys read. You guys read articles about Mars, Pokemon Go, different types of cultural foods in Guatemala, whatever. Any categories, anything that falls under the, the different categories of like science, history, weather, career, sports, animals, travel, anything that's just giving you information, right? So you know more about that topic is an informational text, right? So a textbook about the solar system, informational text, right? A book about what it was like to live in the Middle Ages and about like what is feudalism, what does village life look like. That is an informative text, right? I've got one right here. Get one for you here. History of the medieval world, right? That's something that I'm interested in. This is an informational text, right? It has a lot of really interesting stuff, and as you can see, it's not written like a textbook necessarily, but this is so I know the history of the medieval world from the conversion of Constantine to the First Crusade, right? Why do I want to know about that? Beats me. But that's like an informational text. A narrative nonfiction text like Moonbird is informational as well. So it's everything as dry to like a, science or a math textbook to as interesting as Moonbird, however interesting you happen to think that is, right? And those are the categories of, we're not going to do that. That's if we were like, in person. These are the different categories of the nonfiction that we've got here, right? So what I want you guys to do now is ask me any questions that you have about nonfiction as that category, or the genres of biography, autobiography, or informational texts. Dr. Seuss? I don't know, it's like a children's book. Maybe it's its own genre. The kids like horror, yep. Very good, DJ. Sorry, Nathaniel, no soliciting. I mean, you can post a link to it in the chat. I don't care. Can you write an autobiography about yourself? Yes, you could. I would too, Sarah. No, the ghostwriter's not usually scary. There, uh, it depends. Some famous people sit down and actually write their own, right? But usually they need a little help. Oh, the History of the Medieval World. It's a series about various times. They're actually really, really good. If you're interested in medieval life, I can give you a couple suggestions here. If you're interested and if you really want to know what it was like to live in medieval England, which is super interesting, the first book I would recommend is this one, which is it's called Medieval Lives. And it's it's a very slim volume, and it's got some pictures, and it's very, very accessible. And then if you like this one, again, Medieval Lives by Terry Jones. And if you're interested, send me an email. I'll show you the link. The sort of expanded version of that is called The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England. And this is like all about like things that you would actually see if you were in like a medieval village. It doesn't have a lot of information about like kings and monarchy. It's more about like what would your life have been like. Whereas a lot of other books about medieval England are about the monarchy and things like that. These are very rooted in everyday life. That's antithetical to this, which is going to be about the movements of kings and wars and grand stuff, which is also very interesting but different. And then if you want to know everything, then you can get this book, which is called A Distant Mirror. And this is not a slim volume. And this is going to basically tell you everything that happened in the 1300s, which is, I would say probably like prime time, most interesting 100 years in England's history, at least medievally. It's pretty interesting. What's the goriest story I would let you read, and where can you get it? I don't know. I don't really read horror, so I'm probably not the person to ask. The book's called The Sacrifice. Good. All right, cool. Yeah, you guys have mentioned some amazing books here. Do you have any questions about the genres of nonfiction, what makes them different or anything? And if you don't, you can just say no questions in the chat. As you guys are discovering as I'm moving my books around, is that my shame pile is huge. Although this isn't just my shame pile, I use these books to teach my college class. All right, doesn't look like we have any questions. Very good. All right, let's see what we got next. We're not doing that. Okay, so we have some time for a few of these, okay? So what we're going to do here is I'm going to give you descriptions of books, or actually like a little bit of a clip from a movie, and it's going to be your job to from this list of genres, make your best guess of how you would categorize this book. Like, what genre does it belong to, okay? So the first one is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, and here's the abstract. Ponyboy Curtis and his brother Soda Pop and Derry belong to a group of poor teenage boys called Greasers. Many of them have led hard lives already, and they are tough, angry, and unforgiving. They often fight with Socias, the group of wealthy, privileged boys who beat them up for fun. This is a book you'll read next year with Miss Brunel, and it is fantastic. So just from that abstract, if you had to make a guess right now, if you were a librarian and you didn't have time to read this particular book, if you didn't know it and you had to put that sticker on it, how would you categorize it? The first step is to say, okay, is it fiction or nonfiction? And then once you've chosen that, does it sound like fiction or nonfiction? Then you've got the different genres to go with, right? If you feel like it's fiction, you're going to be choosing from these genres. And if you feel like it's nonfiction, you're going to be choosing from these genres. So go ahead in the chat, tell me, which genre do you think The Outsiders belongs to? And then I'll tell you which one I think it is. And I'll leave them up here for you and give you like a minute to answer. Nathaniel says realistic fiction. Bella says realistic fiction. Jake realistic. Harrison realistic. Sarah realistic. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I think that that's probably right. What do you think, Miss Brennan? You know, there maybe could be an argument for historical fiction, but I think if we think about like sort of like the themes and overall message of The Outsiders, it's probably exists outside of that particular era in American history. I think the realistic fictions probably have it, but I think DJ's leaning into historical fiction could be possible too. I think either are probably a really good answer, but I think you guys have it with realistic fiction. Yep, very good. All right, let's do another one. All right, so this one is a clip, okay? So let's take a peek here. I think I have to have this on for you guys to hear it. So we're going to watch the clip, and then you guys will guess what genre this movie belongs to. It's like a really cringy, mid-2000s trailer, too, which is always great.
Aztec gold. The heathen gods placed upon the gold a terrible curse. 10 years we've searched. Every last piece we have found, save for this. Hello, Bobby.
They've taken Elizabeth.
Welcome aboard the Black Pearl.
We must save her. Where do we start?
Jack Sparrow. He talked about the Black Pearl.
Make a deal with him. He can lead us to it.
You forget your place. You are a blacksmith.
If you spring me from this cell, I shall take you to the Black Pearl and your bonny lass.
You're a pirate.
Forgot one very important thing, mate. I'm Captain Jack Sparrow. Not sure I deserve it. You're not facing normal pirates. Cruel, demented, vicious pirates, to be certain.
Say goodbye.
Goodbye.
But cruel, demented, vicious pirates who cannot be killed. The moonlight shows us for what we really are. That's interesting. We are cursed men.
I hardly believe in ghost stories anymore.
You best start believing in ghost stories, Miss Turner. You're in one. Gents, you all remember Captain Jack Sparrow. Kill him. I'm gonna teach you the meaning of pain.
You like pain? Try wearing a corset.
Here they come.
It's like the trailer that never ends. But you guys got it. So what genre do you think that this film belongs to, right? So first of all, think about whether or not it's fiction or nonfiction. And then once you've got that category decided on, you can go ahead and choose the genre and take into account like all parts of it, right? I'll leave this up for a minute and then you can go ahead and make your choices and tell me which genre you think best fits for Pirates of the Caribbean. It's actually not a bad movie. I think that the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and 11th ones are probably not very good. The first one seems to be okay. All right, let's see what you guys came up with. Yeah, I think so too, Miss Brennan. Yeah, that is a good part, Nathaniel. Fantasy. We had a historical. It's almost historical fiction. Maddie's, yeah, she's waffling between historical fiction and fantasy, and rightfully so. Probably, yeah, same thing with Nathaniel. Yeah, so it would be historical fiction, right? Because, I mean, if you think about what's the, span of time where sort of like pirates sailed and sort of like clashed with the East Indies Trading Company? Not a long amount of time. I think it's a very historically specific piece, but they're ghost skeletons. And as soon as they're unkillable ghost skeletons that have been cursed by Aztec gold, it's fantasy, right? Because that's like ridiculous. It's absolutely that one fact or those few pieces create a scenario in which this becomes a piece of fantasy, right? So it's a piece of fantasy that's highly informed by the setting, but it's fantasy nevertheless. Really, Sarah? Oh, I mean, okay. You know what? I'll give it to you. The thing I like about the third Pirates of the Caribbean movie is, like, I really like the idea of, like, pirate lords. Like, that's really cool. But, like, narratively, I don't know. It's all over the place. yeah. But, like, there is nothing it's building up to. That's great. It's fantasy with a bit of historical fiction. Yeah, exactly, right? It's fantasy that's heavily informed by a very specific time and place. I am not forgetting your comment. All right. You want me to go look up that's the best pirate I've ever seen memes. I like a good meme. I'll do it. Good. All right. Very good, guys. So what we're going to do, start on Friday is we're going to continue going through and seeing if we can identify these different, pieces of media according to what genre they belong to. We're not watching it again, that's for sure. So that is our job Friday. It's going to be, I think most of our online class together will be continuing to just think about genre and identify genres, right? But in the meantime, what I want you guys to do on Wednesday and Thursday during your ELA work time is, number one, you're going to continue working on your rising actions and your climaxes, right? So you're still working inside of this activity, which, as I said, is our last activity, right? The rising action and climax. We're working on this until the end. But what I want you to have, either, maybe as a comment in your piece, is what genre you think your story belongs to best, right? So maybe just in like the top of the title of yours, you can highlight and put a comment. I think the genre which best fits my story is, and then you're going to tell me what genre it is. Now, they're all fiction, so it's going to be one of the genres that fall under that category. But yes, that's what I want you to do. And I'll include this in the instructions, both on Classroom, right? Right here. I'll update this in a second, and on my website. So you're working for 20 minutes on Wednesday and Thursday on your story. If you're still working on your exposition, you can do that too. But what I want you to make sure that you do is, in the rising action piece, identify the genre that you think your story best belongs to. And then we'll review and go and continue to go over genre on Friday. Oh. All right. Very good. So, okay. I will. Do I click on it too, Nathan? Am I like allowed? That's great. I like that, Sarah. Yeah. But I'm really bad at it. I just like fall off of my chair or something. All right, folks. So any questions that you have about fiction, nonfiction, as categories of genres, or any of the genres that we talked about that fall under those categories? Any questions at all about that, or about what I want you to do for Friday? Are we stopping academics on June 9th? Correct. Yes. Yeah. In fact, like June 9th is the first day of like not academics, I think. So Friday is kind of our last academic time together, but I'm going to be seeing you guys next week for some cool stuff as well, which I'll tell you about on Friday. Any questions at all? There's Nathaniel's Twitch handle, so go watch him on Twitch. Gertrude. Perfect name for a slug. Perfect. All right, folks, very good. Excellent job. So we'll have one more day inside of this stream. It'll be our Friday stream will be the last day that we're commenting in this assignment, and then I'll have a new one for you for what we're doing next week. So I'll draw my line here, and we'll pick up here on Friday, 6, what is it? It's like 5th? All right, perfect, guys. Thanks so much for your hard work. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your continued diligence. I really, really do. And I look forward to seeing you guys on Friday for our finishing up our work with genre, taking a peek at your work, and also having our nice Google Meet. Okay? Thanks so much, folks, and I will see you on Friday.